Good afternoon and welcome to Making It in Moreland. Thank you for joining us for our discussion on the environmental art space and the creatives responding to climate change. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm zooming in from, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, their cultural heritage, beliefs and continuing relationship with the land, and acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty was never ceded. I also extend that respect to other First Nations people who are present here today. Today we are joined by Dr. Jen Ray, Lichen Kelp, Jessie Boylan and Gregory Lorenzutti, who will be discussing what the environment means to them and their work, what sustainability looks like in their practice and their artistic hopes for the future. I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator for today, Dr. Jen Ray. Jen is an artist and researcher with over 15 years practice-led research expertise in the discursive field of contemporary environmental art and arts-based environmental communication. Jen is also the director and creative lead of Fair and Falcon Commons. Thank you for joining us. And Jen, it's over to you.
Oh, thank you, Angela. Hello and welcome everybody who's tuning in for this Making It in Moreland discussion. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the Dja-dja-wurrung people as the traditional custodians of the unceded lands and waterways from where I'm speaking from today. I celebrate their enduring connections to country, knowledge, community, and story, and I pay my respect and deepest gratitude to their elders past and present. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands in which each of you are living, learning, and working from today. As we gather online due to the recent COVID-19 lockdowns to share practice and the relationships between art, environment, community, activism, and futures, may we reflect and pay our deepest respect to our First Nations elders here and abroad, as it is their living culture and experiences that hold the key to success for future generations. So I am Jen Ray. I do a lot of work really specifically looking at the role of artists in the climate emergency. I'm interested in food justice, disaster preparedness, and speculative futures. I'm a middle-aged person with short gray hair, fair complexion, wearing blue-gray glasses and black jacket. I'm sitting in a bedroom currently being renovated with some natural gray light coming in the window. You might hear birds, dog barking, or possibly interrupted by my daughter coming through the door. I'm really excited to be here today to be talking about the role of art and artists practicing in the context of what is more broadly in the art world known as environmental art, but more specifically, artists creating within in response to the climate emergency. In the next decade, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we're going to see increasing climatic events with compounding and unprecedented economic, social, and political impacts that will affect livelihoods and ways of life. And to borrow Margaret Atwood's declaration, we're no longer talking about climate change, we're facing everything change, including how we practice as artists in various institutional contexts at home and abroad. It's plausible that within our lifetime, we'll see our venues, galleries, studios, audiences, and other platforms where we create, tour, and present affected. Therefore, we are in a critical time as practitioners to consider our capacities and voices, how we untether from our ways of conventionally working within and across institutional structures, and how we can adapt to the challenges ahead. So, artists are meaning makers, crafters of experience, provocateurs, interlocutors, adept at dealing with uncertainty and complexity. They're agile and responsive thinkers who see risk, failure, and critique as fuel in the creative processes, and most often are resistant to maintaining the status quo. And there are some artists doing some ambitious, critical, and collaborative work in Australia in relation to climate change. And today I'm excited to be joined here with three of those artists with diverse practices intersecting performance, photography, farming, activism, long-form socially engaged projects here and abroad, collaboration and storytelling, with specific inquiries centered around ecology, climate change, human and non-human relations. I'd like to welcome Jessie Boylan, Gregory Lorenzutti, and Lichen Kelp to the conversation. Where are you all calling in from today? Maybe we can start with Jessie.
I'm calling in from Jajawaram country as well. I live in a place called Chewton, which is near Castlemaine in central Victoria.
Great. And Gregory?
I am in Waywurrung country, northern suburbs of Melbourne, Australia, particularly Faulkner.
Welcome. And Lycan?
I'm calling in from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung Stolen Lands, known as Brunswick East.
Excellent. And anyone who's joining us today, if you would like, you can also use the message box to type in where you're calling in from. So to begin, by a way of starting, rather than me reading out your bios, I thought that you could introduce yourself to the conversation by giving a little bit about your practice, and perhaps to think about a critical point or a moment where you first were inspired or prompted to create a work in response to the environment. Is there anyone here who would like to start off with that, rather than putting you on the spot?
We're all going to be very polite.
Okay, Jessie, can you think of?
I can start if you like. I'll just start by describing myself as well. I'm an androgynous looking person with ash blonde hair, blue eyes. I'm fair skinned, of Irish and English descent, and I'm wearing a grey hoodie that says Lon Nosmot in Arabic, which means we will not be silent. My background is I come from a documentary-based background in photography, video, sound, and installation. I'd say now it's much more expanded practice. I'm working with communities across, mostly to do with looking at nuclear legacies in Australia and the impact of uranium mining and other extractive industries here. And I'm very much love working with other people, and I often work in collaborative projects on other art projects as well. And I'm involved with community organisations such as 3CR in Melbourne, Friends of the Earth, and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. In terms of a moment, I think it was when I moved to Melbourne from Canberra to study photography, and I somehow stumbled across Friends of the Earth flyer that was taking people onto Kukatha and Arabana country into the South Australian outback when I was 19, and I jumped aboard the bus and I heard stories of people surviving the atomic tests that happened in Australia in the 50s and 60s, and I heard people's stories from Aboriginal people to nuclear veterans about the impacts of living in the wake of those tests, as well as constant fights against uranium mines and proposed nuclear waste dumps. And I think it was that point when I was with those people in those places that I knew that I wanted to make work that kind of responded to these things. So it was a very kind of specific event, I guess, a process that led me to where I am today, I think.
And you're still creating work in that vein, which we'll get more into.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jessie. How about you, Gregory?
Well, I'm gonna just follow up as Jessie started. I'm a white-looking person, European background, German, Italian heritage, born in Brazil, grew up in Rio de Janeiro, migrated to Australia 9 years ago. And been making work and studying and learning in unceded Aboriginal land. So kind of my practice, my background comes from a place originally from traditional classical ballet training performance, where was my formation in dance, and migrating from there, merging into contemporary dance for 25 years now. And at the same time, back in uni studying documentary photography to expand what I was trying to understand as image making with the body and with cameras. And also from that, when moving to Australia, another door opened up to me was actually a recovery from my first experience in Brazil as a food grower and farmer, that I've been working since basically when I arrived here. I grew up in a family from my mom's side, all farming, with farm, market stalls and that sort of stuff. And I grew up with that. And at this stage, finding this space in between the sharing, aspects of, performance, farming and photography. But I think a crucial point for me in my practice when, environmental issues and activism, let's say, use that word, it started, was very early in my life watching my grandfather as a conservationist in Brazil, working with taxidermy, and then my father later on, and watching them and walking with them in Brazilian forests and listen their stories about, that decaying forest where I was born. And that was imprinted in my head somehow, to take in consideration all the natural systems that were around me while I was making any sort of work, from dance photography or farming, if that makes sense. I'm still working out how to do that. So basically, from those three disciplines, merging into an exploration that I, eager to learn and know more every day.
Yeah, I think we'll come. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you in this panel, was actually about bringing those disparate forms of practice into the present right now. So we'll come back to that. Lichen. Oh, you're just on mute.
Hi, my name's Lichen Kelp. Just a visual descriptor. I've got long dark hair and yellow earrings on, a purple zigzaggy jacket, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf with some ecological texts in there that I'm happy/sad to say I haven't finished reading yet. I find that when I start reading these books, my mind sparks off in all different kinds of directions, and I don't always manage to get to the next page. But so I have sort of a practice of making botanical-based works, which I term electronic ikebana. So they're sound-activated frozen ice sculptures, often with flowers and vegetables and different botanical matter frozen inside, as well as liquid landscapes. So flowers and herbs and different things that I've got growing in my studio garden or locally in the street, being activated by different sort of chemical transformations like dry ice bubbling and things like that. So I started this arts practice a few years ago and started performing this work live with a soundtrack by my partner Dylan Martirell, and it's often accompanied by dancer Benjamin Hancock and friend of ours Jason Hood doing performance. And then I also have a curatorial practice which includes a travelling residency program called Forum of Sensory Motion, where I take groups of artists with me on art adventures to different places, and we create art on the road and present in unusual places. And out of that practice grew the Seaweed Appreciation Society. So in 2018, I held a travelling residency to Whyalla in South Australia. And we dived with the giant cuttlefish there. And it was just such a phenomenal experience. And around the same time, I had changed my last name from Kemp to Kelp. So I was becoming sort of more aware of marine algae and being sent articles and doing my own sort of research about seaweed. And then I got to see these cuttlefish perform seaweed while they were underwater, as they camouflaged themselves against the background, changing colour to seaweed and becoming prickly skinned and sort of motionless. And I think that was my awakening moment, where I, realized that my obsession for cuttlefish that had formed by this point needed to transfer over to awareness raising around the fact that their habitats were under threat from the industry in South Australia and also from the diminishing kelp forests. So that's when I decided to establish the Seaweed Appreciation Society and set it up as a group learning exercise, a research project that could be held in sort of community meetings with marine biologists and artists and getting different people together to celebrate and explore marine algae.
Is this the project that you're doing with Moreland?
Yes, I've got a Seaweed Appreciation Society residency with Moreland at the moment, and that's being held at Siteworks. So once lockdown lifts, we've got some events ready to roll out to share with the public, which is exciting.
Yeah. Hopefully you'll be able to post or on the Facebook page the details of that, or we can ask Angela and Freya to do that. Prior to coming online here, we were having a dialogue, and there's a lot of what we sort of found is that there's a lot of intersections between our practices. And in speaking to each of the artists, I thought the best approach with this was actually to keep it dialogical, and so that we can have a bit of depth in terms of thinking about practice, thinking about practical steps, as well as future visions. And so I invite the artists here to be able to, to ask questions of each other, and so that we can probe a little bit more deeply, rather than me, driving the boat. So maybe I can just start thinking about the context of the now. All of you have a depth of practice. You've talked about raising awareness, documentation, observation, bringing together the disparate parts of your practice in terms of in responding to the environment or specific issues that have happened. I'm wondering what you see as your role as an artist, creative practitioner in climate change discourse, and more broadly, what do you see as the role of artists or other creatives, practitioners in the climate emergency? Okay.
Someone else can go first while I gather my thoughts.
That's a very, Jen, like probably one of the most fundamental questions, that an artist can ask, herself or himself or themselves, now, is how to make, how to repair, actually not to make, but repair the bridge that always existed, as spaces in the planet, about how to repair that bridge between us and the other, if there is such a thing, the other. When you talk about the natural systems, like we are in this mess today. One of the reasons I think is the fact we broke that connection, that we are actually part of the natural system. We are not just witnesses from outside of the system watching the natural world to function in this complex way. We are a conditional part of that system. And the moment we remove ourselves from that equation, that's when we start looking back at, natural systems as a commodity that you can exploit and make, anything you want without taking in account the consequences of, our actions. And I think when you, as an artist, as you said in the beginning, we are meaning makers, we are creative thinkers. We actually problem solvers, artwork always starts with a problem. You set up yourself in a problematic situation, then you try to get out of that. The problem, the question you create yourself, or you're being, placed in. And I just feel like there is a underground current, underwater current, pushing all of us now to reevaluate, whatever practice we do and in whatever field we are working with, or discipline or hybrid practice, or that you have to be accountable, for your choices, and and taking that into your practice. Like I'm super curious to talk about touring. Something that in the performance industry is a massive industry, but what the implications of that into the current global situation, and so on. For photography, Jesse, for us, when we talk about the implications of the art form itself, in the making of photography, what are the resources we use for that. And liking, I'm super curious about, I've seen your work before, and your relationship with organic matter, and how your take on that, when you're approaching that, material, and the extension of your own body as an artist with this organic other body that we work with, that's actually disappearing as you work with. It's quite a photographic element in your practice. I know that.
Yeah, I think I really sort of tend to embody these things that we talk about, which can be really beneficial for an art practice, and it can be non-beneficial for sort of physical well-being sometimes, because I feel like on, a sort of surface level, I'm quite hopeful still, and but it's hard to maintain this role without taking some sort of physical blows. So being named Lichen at birth by my mother was an amazing gift, and I've just finished reading the chapter in Entangled by Merlin Sheldrake called The Intimacy of Strangers, about radical lichenology, and just suffered and happily experienced as well complete biodysmorphia reading this, because I just sort of zoom in and out of feeling like it was talking directly to me about multiple fungal partners or whatever, untethered lichens and different concepts that he was raising. And so with the performance things that you've seen, when I'm using flowers, I was talking to Jen on the phone before when we were introducing each other before this Zoom session, that I sort of started taking on this empathy with these organisms and these botanical elements that I was working with, and feeling like it just no longer sat comfortably with me to be harvesting en masse for the purposes of art. Even though it created beautiful results, it felt like I needed to be doing more in the service of plants. So the next project that I'm doing is an extension of the mulch performance that you saw, Gregory, and it's with Benjamin and Dylan and Jason again at Arts House, and it's an underground nightclub for plants. So we'll be dancing, and we'll be drinking, and we'll be communing together after lockdown in the presence of plants, and I'll be growing them in the lead up to them, propagating, and then passing out these seedlings to people as they leave. And so the idea is partly to act in the service of plants and to further their cause, but also to give the plants a night off, because I feel like there's a lot of pressure on these non-human life forms and non-human landscapes and beings to kind of, be our saviors and get us through the apocalypse or whatever, dreaded scenarios we have. And it's so often selfishly motivated and extractive still, even when we're working in these beautifully rich areas. And so, the idea is just as well to give them a chance to kind of, be in our presence and celebrate each other and have a night off from this intense focus on them.
Oh, that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm so interesting. I love that we're already going into the work and what you're doing. I was just thinking about responding in terms of the question. It is such a big question around the role of artists generally, but also the role of artists in a climate emergency. I mean, I imagine we're all here because we believe that art plays a really critical role, and we can see its generative capacity to not only kind of ask questions, but it's like generating new languages all the time, and languages that come from multiple positions and multiple voices and speak to multiple people across multiple places. Like, it's that beautiful thing that has this capacity to touch some people in this way and touch some people in that way. And it's often, or the way that I'd like to use it is to bring people into stories, into situations, to environments, to places, to histories and knowledges in ways that, it doesn't distance them and doesn't isolate them, and allows them to kind of come with their own complex histories and see something that might say something to them and might make them, think about something or question something or learn more about something. It's not necessarily, of course, if we can galvanize action and make change, that's wonderful. But, even if it's just these tiny little things that prompt a tiny change of thought or even a new thought, I think that is it has this amazing capacity to speak in many different ways. And I think that obviously we're all here with that belief. And I think also about imagination, like that during these times we have a desperate need for future imaginings, and how can we do that through our practice? What does that look like? And I'd be interested to hear what you think, because I know you, Jen, work a lot around the future as well. How can we kind of use this how can we not just reduce the future to another version of the present?
Yeah. I had a conversation with somebody in my driveway quite recently that was asking me they were asking me to do a project, and I said I can't do that project because I can only work within a climate emergency now. Like, I just feel like all of my decisions are framed within the climate emergency, and that just seems really tangential. And it makes me think a lot about audience and for who are we making art for and with? Like, what are the venues? Like, when we put work in galleries, are we creating work that is preaching to the converted? Are we to discrete audiences, like where you put up a show and maybe only 100 people came through? It might be great, 100 great, but it might be that one person that actually can spark that change, that did see that work and so forth. But I'm wondering if you guys can sort of give some perspectives on what you think, how you're engaging with audiences, and how you're, or the participants that get involved in your projects and your work, and the impact, and how does that resonate and the impact of
that? Can I start with that? Or
yeah, absolutely.
You want to jump in, like, and Jessie?
Yeah.
No, you go.
Yeah.
We're so polite. Jessie is right.
Well, you actually, Jen, you touched like something that I don't know if I ever told this story. It happened to me during lockdown last year here in Melbourne. Faulkner Commons and Faulkner Footballs. Well, just a little, no, you talk about Faulkner Commons later, Jen, maybe you get a bit of context, but Faulkner Footballs is an urban farm that's located here in Faulkner, the northern suburbs of Melbourne, and where we practice, a whole range of organic, regenerative practices for food growing in urban settings. So it's like a model, that we are trying to maybe expand or replicate, in other parts. So, last year I was doing a residency with Lucy Gehring, and for a dance work that I've been making. And I was at the same time crazy working at Faulkner Footballs in food production, because Faulkner Commons were doing quite a bit of food relief during lockdown last year. So we were ramping up food production. There was one day I was after the studio, I came to the farm, all that creative mindset. And then Jen gave me a call. So like, do you have an extra bunch of parsley or was mint or something like that? I was like, we do. Okay, I'll put it together. I'll take back inside the Bowlings Club. And then I walked in and I saw all these people coming to pick up their boxes that day. And there was this one person that I looked at, she had a box and she had quite a few of produce coming from the garden. It was just around next door. And then I actually took the liberty, but just approached her. I was like, hey, just wanted to know, like, how you doing, do you like the produce? That sort of question. And then I said, oh, sorry, just because I've seen this quite a bit of things from Faulkner food bowls, and I am one of the farmers here. We grow this food right here, just, right here in the back. And she opened her eyes and she freaked out. And I was like, oh my gosh, did you see something wrong here? Lockdown period, you know what's going on in people's heads. And then she said, it's the first time ever I speak to someone that grew my food.
Mm-hmm.
For me, it was the most incredible moment as an artist to talk to an audience.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Greg. Like, actually, that you framed it there in that sort of arts sense. Like, for those that don't know about Faulkner Commons or Faulkner Food Bowls, this is Gregory and I live in the suburb that was deeply affected during COVID in terms of being an outbreak suburb. We had 181 cases, and on the other side of my fence, I think we had 41 or 44 deaths. It's a food desert. It's in the north of Melbourne, or north of Moreland, and the bowling. All of my work for 2020 that was overseas got cancelled, and so the market garden that my partner started, Kelly Gillespie, is in the third green of a bowling club, and it was harvest season. And being that I have this practice in food futures and this practice in disaster preparedness, I just said to my partner, how are you going to harvest the veggies? This is a very food insecure suburb. And basically, long story short, we started a food hub to help distribute low cost and no cost food. And then Gregory was employed through the Working for Victoria and brought his expertise and creativity to making the market garden into a farm. And one of the things that I just wanted to draw here that I think is really, that I've been really amazed by, is around the creative skills that Gregory brought to the farm and aesthetics and the thinking about bodies in the space. And I brought my sort of project management and choreography skills to making a food hub. Neither of us have ever done anything on this sort of scale, but I think the ability to collaborate and deal with like messy forms and meeting people and dealing with strangers and so forth, and being perpetually responsive is pretty dynamic. And this was an emergency response. So that just contextualizes that. I'm wondering, like, in terms of like extending this conversation, like what you each see. Like, I mean, I'm thinking, Jesse, about the project that you did at the Merri-bek site. Like, I mean, you're dealing with trauma. You're dealing with a major significant event that people didn't know about or didn't pay attention to. Like, I mean, yeah, if you can comment on that.
Yeah, just to give a bit of a background on that project, well, I guess it's sort of not just one project, but many projects over a long period of time. Yeah. And extending on from your first question around what prompted us to do this work, I've sort of continued to do work as an artist alongside the anti-nuclear movement in Australia and with the anti-nuclear movement in Australia, using art as a tool for campaigning as well as a resource for the communities that are facing particular nuclear developments as well. But this particular one I think you're talking about is the Nuclear Futures Initiative, which was a 3-year community arts project which linked atomic survivor communities with artists, not just in Australia, but primarily in Australia. But we also were linked with atomic survivor communities in Japan, in Kazakhstan, in the Marshall Islands as well. And so the project extended worldwide and into the UK as well. But yeah, we worked with both atomic veterans, so had kind of community-based projects in a small town called Balaclava in regional South Australia, where there's a atomic veteran named Avon Hudson who lives there, and he was a nuclear whistleblower. But we're also embedded in the Yalata community, which is in far western South Australia, just near Ceduna, just west of Ceduna, a couple of hours on the west coast of South Australia. And it's actually one of the communities that the Maralinga, well, Anangu Pinjara, Yankunytjatjara people were pushed out during the atomic testing program in the 50s and 60s. And so they were actually spread in all directions, and many people left and walked south on foot. And so their communities were, disconnected and separated and moved from red sand to white sand and came across new foods and things they hadn't come across before. And so Yalata was a kind of was a mission, became a settlement for people from Maralinga. And so we worked, went with a huge group of artists and community organisers and community development practitioners as well, were kind of engaged with the Yalata community to do a huge amount of different kinds of projects. Two which came out of it were these installations, these immersive installations that got to tell the story of that process of dislocation from land. And another one was working with the veterans and telling the veterans' story around cancers and intergenerational impacts of, being impacted by both psychological and also health impacts of being contaminated by nuclear fallout. But also the project was, we had a sculpture got made through the men's art group that got installed in the Nagasaki Peace Park as a commemoration of the survivors in Australia, and that there had been nothing in that place that represented Australia prior to that point. So it kind of expanded borders and boundaries and countries, and it brings atomic survivors together worldwide. And we got to, people from Yalata got to go to Japan and tell their story as well. And, people in Japan, like survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had never heard Australian stories of nuclear testing and didn't even know that had happened as well. So, yeah, it was quite expansive and very beautiful. But I think, and it was a project that's about countering state stories, official narratives about what happened in these places and who was affected by them, and the fact that it's actually not finished. These are unfinished stories. The effects are still ongoing. People are still dealing with the fact that Maralinga is a contaminated landscape and people cannot return to live back on that land. And they were still finding out just a couple of weeks ago how it's even more contaminated than we thought it originally was. And so, there's lots of things that are part of this story, and that's something that's ongoing. Like, it's obviously that project had a 3-year time frame, but it started before that, and it continues beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm doing some research right now on the impact of long form projects, socially engaged projects, and one of the things that I keep hearing is around intention. That most of the people that I'm talking to, they didn't intend them to be long form projects, right? They were inspired, or something happened, and then they've they're deeply embedded in the community, and they're forming these relationships, and it becomes a very iterative process. And it sounds like this project of yours is developing that way, and it's revealing, different avenues, like to create platforms to create work with. I'm wondering if if you've experienced anything similar, like, because your work, even your mulch project, it does have this iterative effect. And I'm wondering if in sort of that laboratory experimental space of observation, if you're seeing something very similar.
I think that once these ideas gain traction and you feel like they need to be shared with a wider audience and wider participants, then there's so much value in doing things more than once and expanding upon those ideas and really teasing out the motivations and intentions, as you're talking about, and doing them more and more sort of closely and more considered each time.
Because like Gregory, you're, coming to spending a whole year in 2020 pretty much not dancing, right? Or being able to go out and do documentation and really doing a lot of farming and so forth. How, and I know maybe you can talk about some of the things that you have in the works that are coming out of this, like that are bringing together, the three different axes of your practice, and how they're sort of really deeply engaged with that hyperlocal.
I think what Jessie and Lycan were talking about of the consideration, and you said intention. It's if the feeling that I gather from all this experience, the whole world we've been living in, with climate emergency, and now most, recently, COVID, we can't avoid that, the implications of that, and the connections with, the climate emergency that also has implications, with. I feel there is a demand, for, especially from audiences, and what response, what creative solutions or creative ideas can we, get from or to for those questions. And then I think as in working with, not being able to dance for a whole year, I have to find outlets in the farming, experience to embody movement. And what actually farming, informed 2020 was the complexity of the physiological, biological human body is a replication of the complex relationship underground for the soil health. And that sounds a bit like, a bit after, crazy ideas, but actually you start reading some papers and you understand the microorganisms and the micro elements that compose any living, substance underground as the same ones that compose our bodies. So actually, as I was farming, I could actually understand that physicality in the farming as you're growing, especially growing food, because you see that so fast, some seeds they're constantly in climate emergency state because they're growing in a matter of like 4 weeks, they're ready to go. If I watch radishes growing, I watch, lettuces growing, and I feel like they know exactly what's going on and they have to be ready like that. And watching that, and as you farm, I just felt the physicality of the dancer was becoming more and more stronger. But in the other way around, being back in the dance studio, making work, I was pushed to a way to understand that I couldn't fit my work in a conventional dance space anymore. And I have to shift to where I was doing dance work. So where this is going now, it's hard to say because it's an ongoing, and probably going to take a few seasons, Like now for development, I talk about seasons, like how many seasons to develop a work. Is it going to develop it through, winter and spring? Or it's not like, it's hard because when you talk to funding bodies, they want to understand in a time frame. And I was saying, well, I'm talking about seasons here. Like we are all part of the living bigger system, including you, so how let's bring the conversation underground.
Wow. I mean, this is something that came back. It's responsive to something you said earlier, but also right here, like in our First Nations cultures and First Nations cultures around the world, there isn't a separation between the word environment and self, right? And you were talking about bringing things back to connection. Maybe there is something happening right now in terms of retreating and rethinking and reorganizing and so forth, that is allowing us to observe and be more responsive, you know, as practitioners. And is it something unique to the artist's skill set or thinking that that allows that to happen, or sensitivity? You know, is there something in the skill set? I'm curious for your thoughts on that.
Something interesting that Jessie was saying before about giving people that she was working with opportunities to travel and meet people internationally, I found really interesting, that sort of idea of reciprocity and going into these projects as, you know, kind of a form of care, essentially, where you're providing services is the word that's coming to mind, but horrible word, but you're providing, you know, opportunities and knowledge and experience for the people that you're working with. And sort of ideas that I've been, you know, coming across in reference to environmentalism and activism recently is that it's essentially care work. It's care for the environment, and to do that care, you also need to be caring for the people who inhabit those lands first and foremost. And so I think both Jessie and Gregory are illustrating that so beautifully in their practices.
Yeah. The plants and stuff that you said you were growing in your laneway.
Yeah, so I think also Gregory was talking about, you know, the problems that you come across and how they turn into elements of your practice. And so for me, not having soil that we could plant directly into, because we lived in a warehouse surrounded by concrete for many years, and then moved into a townhouse that has a tiny courtyard that we're not allowed to dig into because it was an industrial site beforehand. So we've spent lots of time in our street that we live in, which has a really active community, building up sort of garden spaces and garden boxes, and growing outside the studio building, and then also in our courtyard. And my balcony at the moment is covered in little propagating pots for this mulch performance. So yeah, I think there's always like a nice sort of space to inhabit where you identify these problems and then work out how they can, you know, be resolved. And then they, you know, you end up sort of exploring that so much that it does inherently become part of your performative or practical work.
I think also, yeah, you know, thinking about, I don't know, the kind of radiuses of our worlds getting smaller, obviously, in the last little while due to the pandemic. It feels like a lot more people have turned much more locally in terms of what they're focusing on and what they're thinking about, and, you know, what is kind of more immediate in our circumference, and, you know, noticing things really differently. I mean, I'm very lucky because I live in regional Victoria, and, you know, being home a lot more last year, I started to notice things that I hadn't noticed before, like at what point the frogs started making noise, and you know, at what point the cockatoos would come over at a particular time of night, and, you know, like all of these things that are always there, and but it's like only that process of actually being here and not kind of always looking at those circumferences that are like further and further out, and realizing, you know, coming back into that hyperlocal spaces. And I think that that's possibly, I don't know if that relates to your question around, you know, what we're focusing on, and coming much more closer in into these, how these materials, or, you know, the world and us are this same thing. There's this, you know, interconnectedness and interdependency that maybe has become more evident during this process. I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Like, I mean, you know, the fact of being grounded, right? And being, you know, whether it's stuck or choosing to stay in a space. Like, do you see yourselves continuing in this hyperlocal sense? You know, if borders open up, or, you know, I'm curious.
It's super kind of fraught for me, because I'm someone who's always been extremely restless, and who has managed to kind of combine restlessness and wanting to always be on the move, with having a family that do need to be grounded, or they, choose to be grounded, and how I balance that with wanting to be in different places and spaces and with different people all the time. And so the first pandemic was like the first week or two, I was just in a state of absolute panic. I'd just kind of, got this work happening down in East Gippsland that I was, getting to have independence and, traveling to quite regularly. I was down there 6 times in 2019, taking different artists with me on micro residencies on Float, which is it's a floating houseboat residency down on Lake Tyers. And so then sort of being, told by outside forces that I couldn't continue this work anymore, and that, to be stuck inside the house was just like something that I'd just kind of, in the last few years had got space from and was really enjoying. And then it, over the weeks and months that came afterwards, I sort of slowed right down, and, like everybody started really enjoying that hyperlocal experience of, just one-on-one time with close friends in neighbourhood parks, and really kind of getting to know and value, the community and the streets. And, luckily I already had a very strong community in our street, and they sort of definitely all helped each other survive it kind of emotionally, which was fantastic. But coming out of this current lockdown, I'm still keen to be doing road trips and, getting out into East Gippsland and working with the people in the community that I've been working with down there. The international residencies that I was doing a few years ago, I'd already sort of started deciding that they were no longer, environmentally sustainable, that I no longer felt comfortable doing environmental work with artists internationally and catching planes and doing all that work and, burning up the atmosphere doing it. So I had already sort of situated my practice more closely within Australia before the pandemic, but it still involves very long distance travel, like to, as Jessie would be aware of, if you travel by road to the places that you work out of in South Australia, it's like 17 hours plus road trips, which, can be incredible sites for sharing and sort of collaborative dreaming with the artists that you're traveling with on those road trips, but you're still burning up petrol and not really helping the climate emergency. So this is a problem space that I'm kind of trying to tease out at the moment, and how to work these traveling residencies that I want to continue doing, how I can do them more ethically and environmentally. So that might involve train travel, but the train line between Melbourne and East Gippsland is just so poor. Like, it's just not a world-class, transportation system at all. It hasn't got internet. It hasn't got a food cart. It's like usually being swapped out for a bus, and people can't do their work or their reading or all the, enjoyable things that train travel can bring. So one of my future projects is to work closely with V-Line and do some performances and poetry and different things on the train line, and try and bring some attention to this mobile kind of space, and how important it is for people that are, living and working down in East Gippsland, and how important that connection is for people living regionally to still have to the city. So often it's situated as one or the other, but I think all of us want to have access to both, ideally, and it's a balance of how much of either that we want. But there was an incredible story I came across. I don't have all the details now, but it was in Canada, a remote community, an Indigenous remote community had their train line cut, and they activated and were successful in reinstating that train line, and it became a Canadian Inuit operated and managed train service, which I just thought was really incredible story. So yeah, I think eventually I'd like to do an electric car project once I can gather enough sponsors and funding to get some cars together to convert to electric and have it as a mobile residency kind of project that's feeling a little bit less problematic.
Thank you. I like the sound of that. Jesse or Gregory, how about your reflections?
It just found it interesting because maybe what I could add to that, like it's so fascinating thinking about arts collaboration in the current scenario, for all of us, especially when you work, in this cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary field that we, constantly talking to different artists from different areas, and eventually they are not, in the same place. But one of the things actually, I always wanted to be a hyperlocal. I think maybe one of the reasons is because I'm not from Australia. So when I moved here, I wanted to work with Australian artists, whoever was here. I wanted to know the artists from this place. And I was feeling this like hunger and thirst to know Australian artists and all the artists living in Australia that I could, collaborate with, that I could learn from, I could understand the art, the ethos in the practice, and see where, we could establish a dialogue. And I kind of like, that's what's been happening to me, for the last maybe 9 years that I've been here. I've done works, overseas, but my biggest, focus and intention, going back to that word, was said in the beginning, was to be working with and understanding more and more Australian artists. One interesting thing was actually last year, because of everything what happened, in our area here was so badly affected by COVID, as Jen was saying. In a very organic way, I got to know so many incredible artists that were actually living around me in the same neighborhood, and I didn't even know them. And for me, it was a moment of like, aha, was like that, like and just still having that, internal conflict sometimes, there are people, there are, situations where I want to place myself in, and eventually I'm not here, and they would cause an impact. But on the other hand, there are so many other things happening around here that I still don't know about it. And that I'm deeply interested to know even more. So I'm just feeling, as talking about the seasons, for the next seasons, definitely there are people around here that there's a lot of food for thought, and there's a lot of food for growing food.
Yeah.
Jesse, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this as well. But I've just had a little prompt to just reach out to anyone who's viewing this right now. If you have any questions for the panel, feel free to put them in the message box there, and we'll try to address them before the close of this conversation. But I'm going to hand it over to you, Jesse.
Oh, I guess I think I'm in a similar position. I'm both interested in being more kind of hyperlocal, and similarly last year, like, it was a great kind of opportunity to realize just how many wonderful people there are in this community doing really amazing things with lots of different skills across so many different areas, and like connecting with heaps of other people, artists and farmers and, woodworkers, and like, there are these people that are doing amazing things here. And it was so nice to kind of, I knew that intellectually and, somewhat practically, but last year I think really brought that home. And I think I also would love to keep moving. And I find that often when I'm away from my home, I'm more in tune with the work that I'm making, which I don't know what that's about, but I guess it's getting away from the day-to-day life of here. And so I think that's, I love traveling, and I love being with people in different places, and what happens in those places when we come together from different places and come together into a new space, or a familiar space as well. So there is a bit of a challenge and a ethical decisions around those things. But also some of my main collaborators don't live in Victoria. They live in South Australia and live in New South Wales, and we're always meeting in the virtual world, but it's always way better when we're together in person. So I don't know, I think it's both. I'd love to keep doing both. And yeah.
One of the projects that's arisen out of my travels down to East Gippsland is working closely with the woman who runs the Float residency program, Andrea Lane. And her and I have partnered to do this project, which is going to grow into a business and probably be taken over by, a local East Gippslandian person who can run it as a business. But it's called the School of Untourism. And so the idea is to bring like creative and sustainable tourism to East Gippsland. And I think it's a really, interesting model that can be, rolled out in different places as well. But it's about connecting visitors with, sort of eco tour operators and artists and workshops. And we did a launch as part of Waterfront in March this year, which was phenomenal, probably one of the biggest projects I've been involved with so far in terms of the amount of people that I was like, in communication with. And there was 12 events over the Easter weekend, and I held a kayak orchestra as part of that and a Seaweed appreciation dinner, which was really great. But yeah, this is sort of a really great space, I think, for holding like conferences and talks, whether they're online or down in East Gippsland or somewhere in the middle, on these kind of questions, and spending days and, hours and however long is necessary to kind of talk about them in great detail and ways of sort of moving forward in this ecological space that, yeah.
The thing is like, this isn't over. Right? Like disaster, I work a lot in a disaster preparedness context, and we talk about the long climate emergency, right? We talk about cumulative impacts, we talk about sudden impacts, we talk about slow onsets, or like Jessie, what you call slow emergencies, like through your Rupture project. I'm wondering, I'm considering the audience who might be watching this today, or the recording of it, who might be creative practitioners or audiences who might be new to this, right? And do you have any sort of advice to somebody who might be an emerging artist, or an artist who has an established practice, who actually might want to engage with this? Like, do you have any tips or practical thoughts that might help direct them?
I think it's really easy to get, very weighed down and panicked by the climate emergency and feel like you have to just sort of drop everything you're doing and start again and, take up a completely different field of much more sort of ecologically valuable work. But I think there's always value in what people are doing and ways that they can do what they're doing in a more sustainable way. And so sort of exploring what areas of their practice they don't feel comfortable with and trying to change those elements, and then where possible, I guess, letting people know what they're doing and sharing it. And that's the only advice I have at this point.
Thank you. How about you, Gregory?
Oh, well, yeah, I was thinking, what could I say? I mean, I'm looking for advice, so but no, there's one thing that I maybe this maybe last 2 years have taught me a big lesson, and I've been trying to go even deeper on that, is just don't there for a long time in my career I was scared of being split in my practices. When people ask me, what do you do? I was like, oh, do contemporary dance, but I'm a documentary photographer, but also I'm a farmer. And people are like, what? Like, they could hang on, I can't get it. So how does it happen? And I never could explain that to clear words. And it always that put me on the back foot. And today I just finding a place of reconciliation within myself of being able to dive into different disciplines and don't feel they are actually, I'm dispersing my thinking process and my practice, but actually I'm merging into a different field that's, for me, it's not a different field for the world, but it's a different thing for me. And the idea of the internal dispersion, you can have when you work in different disciplines is actually find the internal calmness that you can merge apparently diverse fields, but later on you might understand, we might see it, that they are the closest thing they could ever be in the world. When you think about natural systems, and everything, as it's interconnected, and it's just a matter of your practice and a day-by-day, basis, a daily basis, how you reconnect within yourself and the other people that been working with, listening, talking, dialoguing, how you connect those dots, and then you find this narrative for your work.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I'm really, I guess the only thing that I keep learning more is like other people, asking other people and engaging other people is always the best thing. I think as artists and, certainly through art school institutions and things, we're taught that the artist is an individual and that we're like, this individual genius and we've got our own mind and we've got to come up with our own ideas and we've got to operate on our own. And like, I think that what I've learned more and more through doing work with other people and, this great practice called doing it with others, which is future fields, theory, further fields, around kind of doing things and disrupting that kind of traditional hierarchies of artists and ownership and authority and authorship as well. I think that if you don't know how to do something, or you want to learn more about something, like other people have so much to share and to give, and it's such a wonderful process when there are more voices and skills and conversations happening. And I think not to be afraid to kind of step outside of that, I'm an artist and I do it this way. Like I think I'm constantly learning how to be emerging into new areas, into different fields, and to ask and to, to not be afraid to go, I don't know how to do that. So how do I either learn from someone else how to do that, or how do I engage them in that process? And it's always a better, outcome when there are more voices in the mix, I think, for me anyway.
Yeah, like I often say that, like it took all of the skills and the knowledges to get us into this really difficult space that we're in right now. It's going to take all the skills and knowledges for us to get out of it. And, and that climate change is less about an environmental crisis and more about a cultural and communications crisis. And that is, that's where I think artists can step in, and, coming back to like the garden, we know that a monoculture, it destroys the landscape, right? It's the biodiversity and the interrelationships between the plants communicating and so forth, and the tending and the care for that soil that things grow, and it's there's that collaboration, right? So, there are artists working in this field. This is actually just making me think of the space. Like you're doing your project in the basement of Arts House, like in the basement of Arts House, that's where this new work is. I just finished a film in the basement with Claire Coleman called Refugium, and the word refugium actually comes from biology. And what it is when an organism is in a volatile situation, what it will do in terms of its own self-survival is that it will retreat. And in its retreat, it's called refugium, it will reorganize, and it will only come out into the world once it has reorganized itself. And it's a thing of survival. So, it's sort of interesting that you're going back into that space and you're going to be growing, but and Alex, and I mentioned this even in our conversation earlier, that Alexis Wright, who is the author of Black Swan, has done a podcast with the magazine Emergence, and she talks about she doesn't use the term refugia or refugium. She talks about artists in crises and so forth, and dealing with all of this sort of volatility, how they retreat, and it's in that retreat that the greatest of creativity comes forward. So that might be something others might want to read about. I see. I haven't had any questions come through yet from Freya, but I'm interested in terms of your views on. Are you hopeful? What are your visions for the future? Is it dystopic, utopic? Is it ecotopic? Is it something else?
I think for me, it's mildly utopic. I think if we're looking at it as more of a social and cultural crisis than an environmental crisis, I feel like that work can be done, and that we can do it, together, and that we can do it reasonably quickly, and that there can be areas of healing. And I just don't feel like there is any value in being completely, wiped out by solastalgia. Solastalgia is a word that means literally a nostalgia for the present, but has been used more widely to sort of describe depression around climate change. And, I guess we can't choose to not feel solastalgia or choose to, be hopeful. But I think there's just more value in getting the work done and getting on with it. And once you feeling comfortable in the area that you're working in, that it is, not necessarily out to save the world, but making, those sort of micro differences in the worlds that you move in, then you can feel comfortable with your own existence and try and make others feel comfortable with theirs as well. And then, and then the depression can ease somewhat.
Wow, that's great, Lycan, because I was thinking the image of a farm or a garden, probably like when you ask me, like, are you hopeful? Every time when, work with the soil and you sow seeds and something happens, that's a sign that there is a chance for survival. There is a chance for recovery, for regeneration. Mm-hmm. But also what we learn is what I learn, and it's not done on its own. It is a constant collaboration there. Mm-hmm. The seed, it won't do that on its own. As an artwork, it won't come up on its own. It is a constant conversation with other parts that are all come together. And the only way, because is they are listening to each other. And so those little parts, in the soil working together, protozoa, micronutrients, nematodes and fungi and bacteria, they all talk to each other. They have this listening. Now it's my time to tap in and give a push here. Now I retreat, and then you act because it's your turn. And that constant, collaboration, it finds this constant, I'm so skeptical. I'm now becoming quite aware of not using the word sustainability. I'm a bit, but it turns into this strong bind in between the little parts. And that's what you see, the soil community, the soil food web. And for us, I think when you bring their image back to us, it's all about that listening space. And I do believe listening is healing.
Yeah. And I think that the kelp forests and the, algal worlds in the ocean sort of represent those same spaces as, the mycorrhizal and the just in creating the sort of keystone kind of base environment for all, life forms in that space to grow amongst and grow from. And talking of mycorrhizal and sort of microbial sort of healing spaces. Jessie, I don't know if you've ever looked at the work that's been done around mycology and sort of healing the soil of mining sites, and I'm not sure about nuclear waste sites, but yeah, super interesting.
Well, yeah, there's certainly interesting things happening in Chernobyl, where previously we thought that the land will be never able to come back. And there's all sorts of interesting things happening.
Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, I guess I just add that I also feel like, the systems must fall. The future must be different. And I think that it's like, when we see all the amazing things that everyone here is doing, and, we're just 4 people in this space, and it's amazing to see. I know so many people doing such great things, and I think I feel immense hope and possibility for massive change, and it has to happen. Of course, you can get so lost in all the horror and the trauma of what is happening, and every day whenever a new species goes extinct, it's of course it can be incredibly hard to scramble out of those spaces. But I think that we can see that there's a swell and upswell, and of course things must change.
That's great that you're all in that hopeful mindset. It's made me think about going back to plants. When I was in Chicago and was doing a tour with the American Indian Center in terms of a land back project, but the land back that they were given was a former petrol station, and they were allowed to create a community garden in the petrol station, which everyone knows petrol stations are contaminated sites. And the community there were just growing sunflowers, tobacco, and there was one other plant, dandelions. Yeah, it was dandelions. And I was asking them about this, and they created a community space on the site. And they said that they will only plant those plants over and over again because they're traditional medicine plants, and that they will do their work, and they will take the toxins from the soil. And around this time, I was asked, and just even recently with Keg D'Souza's work at Arts House, it was a plant-based project, and I was thinking about the dandelion. Like the dandelion itself, you would know, Gregory, that if you see a whole bunch of dandelions in an area, you don't disturb them. That what they're doing is they're doing good for the soil. They're extracting all of the toxins out of the soil. In reflecting upon that sort of hyperlocal, I'm being tangential here, but with purpose. Everyone is sitting in place, right? Like in this very hyperlocal place. It's something like we can all be dandelions, right? And we can be, observing what's going on and listening and watching what's happening, but also extracting some of the toxins that are within our own communities, right? And that's a place to be hopeful. Right? Because if you're doing it within your own community, if, we can go and we can do projects overseas and so forth, but if we can't do it within our own community, right, then there's a problem. But if we can, that's when possibly, the magic happens.
I like that metaphor, just in terms of the dandelion, like seed head, and how sort of ephemeral it is, and how, I guess I'm sort of interested in ephemeral work anyway, but the idea that it's not so much about us, but that this work can, disseminate through these, seeds of dandelions and create their own new lives beyond us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid if you're being seen as a disturbance.
Yeah. Yeah. Or I mean, right there, it's like addressing the status quo, or, like we're being seen as it, or, the dandelion being seen as a weed, right? Like, I mean, it's rich with possibilities.
Yeah.
And
being transplanted from your sort of, former home into a new land and being considered a feral species, but what good can you do in that space?
Yeah, there's lots of metaphors in that. we have about 8 minutes left, and I don't have any more questions, but I thought I'd throw it over to you, to all, to if there was anything that you thought you might want to ask of each other or put forth or share, what you might have upcoming.
I mean, I'll be curious to know what, Lycan and Jessie are up to at this stage, or what you see, coming up, maybe that's not in a working field right now, it's not in the work environment for you, but is in your imagery or desires.
Good question.
The Desire Project.
So I mentioned the Desire Project before, which is the electric vehicle project. And the idea with that is that there would be a convoy of cars and that they'd be being converted in an open workshop kind of setting so that people could learn from, experts and have sort of the process demystified a bit. And then potentially also working with 2 artists who I've worked with a bit in recent times and over the years, David Haynes and Joyce Hinterding. Their Desire project for working on float is to work with lithium harvested from the ocean. So kind of combining these projects around lithium batteries and solar charged electric cars. And then each car in this project that I'm dreaming up would go on to have its own life beyond the project. So it would become an art vehicle that, people could potentially run a micro business from. And my vehicle would be a portable Seaweed library. And just dreaming about that idea gets me through a lot of other projects. This idea of I just want to be allowed to pull up in an electric car to the beach and read books and share the books that I'm reading about, marine spaces with people that walk up to me and ask me what I'm doing. Finally, get a chance to read those books I mentioned at the beginning of the...
Do you know, if I have so many, I'm always like, oh, I'd love to do this, I'd love to do that. I have so many kind of, bringing together people, different kinds of people on different projects. But I think some things that I am kind of looking forward to is continuing collaborations with different people, and my collaborators, Virginia Barrett and Linda Dement, continuing works that, it has seemingly seen an end, but we keep making them have new paths and new ways of seeing them. And I think that's something that extends on that long form conversation, is you do a project, but it's does it need to finish at that point? Can it have a new life? Because I think these conversations are still relevant, and they're ongoing, and they're, we find new ways of addressing them, and we gain new kind of attentions towards them. And I think for me to kind of keep on those and developing and building on those things is a great kind of, not just letting them kind of disappear, I think, and giving them new life is always something that I'm interested in doing. But at the moment I'm working on a project around an air monitoring station in northwest Tasmania, northwest Litchfield, Tasmania, and working with scientists there to look at how they're monitoring global atmospheric conditions in one of the cleanest air sources in the world. And I'm kind of trying to figure out ways to make my practice collaborative with them, and to think about ways of engaging with this huge kind of, again, it's all of these things that we've been talking about. They're these huge questions and issues of our time, but again, making them connect to different audiences and to different people, and to make them kind of part of an ongoing conversation, campaign, resource, and lobbying, and making them have multiple ways of being part of a conversation, and not just having one kind of, oh, it's an exhibition and it's gone, trying to develop other ways of having the conversation to go on. Yeah, that's what I'm looking forward to.
I'd love to just keep this going, I always feel like in an hour you're just getting going, and 3 hours is perfect, with a feast as well at the same time. But we only have a couple more minutes left here. But I wanted to thank you all for saying, yeah, I'll show up on Saturday afternoon and do a Zoom. It would have been wonderful to meet you all in person. Also, I just want to acknowledge Moreland Council for creating platforms like this. You know, oftentimes, you know, funding bodies or governments, you know, they're bureaucratic institutions, and it's hard to get things happening. But when there are platforms like this for artists to talk and for audiences to listen or engage or ask questions, I think we need more of this, especially in that knowledge sharing capacity. Moreland Council is going to put this recorded version up with YouTube, and Angela can talk all about this. So anyone who's listening can look up each of the artists' websites that have been speaking today. But I'm looking forward to, you know, maybe reconnecting out in the real world once we're out of this lockdown. And I wish you the best. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to all meet up in real life and keep the conversations going, and invite you all down to East Gippsland.
Love that. Love that. Okay, thanks. Angela, we'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I just want to, on behalf of Moreland City Council, thank all of our speakers today, Jen and Gregory and Lycan and Jessie. Really appreciate the incredible conversations that we've had. It is too short. I think it would have been great to hear you sort of, you know, over a glass of red wine or something, and yeah, continue this conversation. So maybe we can do that at some other point. So thank you. I'd also like to thank a couple of other people that have been instrumental in getting the Making It in Moreland program up and running, and that is Freya Gillard and Anna Held. Freya has also been the magical person in the background who has made all of this work so seamlessly, except for my own little blunders. So she's done a fabulous job. So thank you to you, Freya. We have 2 more Making It in Moreland sessions on Saturday the 19th of June, so a fortnight from today. And these ones are more sort of practical sessions. So one is on grant writing, and the other is on access and inclusion for art spaces and venues. So do come along to those as well. As Jen mentioned, all of the websites of our artists have been put on the Facebook page, so you should see that there. And once we've got these videos captioned, we'll actually be putting them on the Arts Moreland YouTube page as well. So you'll be able to watch these back in a couple of days. So thank you once again.
Okay, go gently.
Thank you, Angela.